The bell rang, signaling the start of a new school day at Lincoln High School, a bustling suburban campus filled with students from every walk of life. It was a fresh semester, and as always, Mr. Adams, the senior-year history teacher, was preparing for another routine day of lectures. However, today would not be like any other. As the students shuffled into class, their chatter filled the air, a mix of laughter, excitement, and groans of anticipation. Mr. Adams adjusted his glasses and greeted each student, giving them a polite but distant nod. His eyes, however, were immediately drawn to one particular student, Malik Walker. Malik was a new transfer student, one of the few black students at Lincoln High. He had arrived just a week ago, his deep brown eyes carrying the weight of untold stories. Though his appearance was quiet and unassuming, there was an aura of intelligence about him that piqued Mr. Adams' curiosity. But curiosity quickly turned to skepticism. "You must be Malik," Mr. Adams said, his tone colder than he intended. "I trust you're ready for the challenges ahead." Malik nodded silently, offering a polite smile. His confidence was hard to gauge. It wasn't arrogance, nor was it self-doubt. It was as if he knew something others didn't, though no one could say what that was. Mr. Adams observed him closely as he took a seat in the middle of the classroom, pulling out a notebook and pen, ready for the lecture to begin. The other students were already making assumptions. Malik didn't fit the typical mold of the other students in this suburban school. He wasn't excelling in every subject like the top achievers, nor was he falling behind in the way some others were. In fact, he was quiet, too quiet. And that made Mr. Adams uneasy. As the class began, Mr. Adams launched into the lesson. The topic was World War II, and while he had taught this subject dozens of times, today's lecture felt different. His attention kept drifting back to Malik. He couldn't help but wonder, why was the boy so withdrawn? Was it because of his background? His situation? Or was he just not a good student? Malik had transferred from a school in a much rougher part of the city, a place where resources were scarce, and the students were often overlooked. It wasn't uncommon for students from those schools to struggle, but Mr. Adams couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Could Malik truly keep up with the rigor of this school? Did he belong here? "Let's dive into the causes of the war," Mr. Adams said, trying to focus on the material. "What can we attribute the start of World War II to? Who can give me an answer?" A few hands shot up around the room, eager to participate. He called on Jessica, a bright and popular student, who quickly recited a textbook-perfect answer. "The Treaty of Versailles, the rise of fascism in Germany, and economic instability, Mr. Adams." "Correct," he nodded, offering a smile. He scanned the room, waiting for the next hand to go up. His eyes fell on Malik, who hadn't raised his hand or spoken a word. For a split second, Mr. Adams wondered if Malik even understood the material. Maybe he was too distracted. Maybe he didn't care. The room grew quieter as the students focused on the lesson, but Mr. Adams couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Malik. He tried to push the thoughts aside and pressed on with the lecture. The students seemed to be engaging, but Malik's silence persisted. His lack of participation was starting to bug Mr. Adams, though he wasn't sure why. It wasn't just the silence. It was the fact that Malik hadn't made any attempt to stand out, to prove he was worthy of being in this class. The other students, even the ones who weren't as academically gifted, tried to make their mark somehow, through humor, through answering questions, through being part of the social fabric of the classroom. But Malik? He was nothing like them. He was a ghost in the room, his presence almost invisible. Mr. Adams couldn't help but wonder, was Malik just another student who slipped through the cracks, one of those who just didn't care enough? Or was there something more to this? Could it be possible that Malik was, indeed, a quiet genius? The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, but Mr. Adams' mind was racing. As the students filed out, he lingered behind, watching Malik leave with his head down, as if trying to avoid drawing any attention to himself. The next day was much the same. Malik was there, but always in the background. He didn't raise his hand to answer questions, didn't participate in discussions, didn't make friends easily. He was always the last one to speak and the first one to leave. Mr. Adams tried not to let his doubts show, but they lingered in the back of his mind. He began to wonder if Malik was just another statistic, another student from a rough neighborhood who couldn't quite hack it in a place like Lincoln High. By the end of the week, Mr. Adams was certain Malik wasn't performing as he expected. His grades were average at best, and his participation was non-existent. As Mr. Adams reviewed the grades for the first assignment, his thoughts were consumed with frustration. There was no way Malik could be an exceptional student if he wasn't even trying. Was it possible that Malik was just here because of the school's diversity quota? Did he really deserve to be in this class? Malik Walker, Mr. Adams muttered to himself as he marked the paper. Let's see how you handle this next test. But as the days passed and Malik remained silent, Mr. Adams grew more and more convinced that he had already made up his mind. Malik was just another student who, for whatever reason, wasn't up to par. Little did he know, this judgment would be proven wrong in a way that would stun him beyond belief. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Malik Walker sat at his desk, his fingers tapping gently on the edge of the worn notebook in front of him. The history class was in full swing, but his mind drifted. He wasn't thinking about the textbook on his desk or the lecture that Mr. Adams was giving. No, Malik was thinking about something far more personal, something that was always with him, even when he wasn't aware of it. Malik wasn't just any student. He was a survivor, shaped by a life that demanded more from him than it should have. He didn't come from a wealthy family. In fact, his family lived in one of the toughest neighborhoods in the city, a place where hope sometimes felt like a distant dream. His mom, Linda, worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet, always tired but always pushing forward. She was his rock, his guiding star. It was because of his mom that Malik had developed a love for learning. Linda never had the opportunity to go to college, but she always stressed the importance of education. Your mind is your ticket out of here, Malik, she would often say, her tired voice full of conviction. Don't let anyone make you believe you can't be great just because of where you come from. Malik's life hadn't always been easy. He'd lost his father when he was just a child, a casualty of the streets. The loss of his dad had affected him deeply, leaving a hole that his mom couldn't fill. She had done her best, but it was hard. Very hard. Every day was a battle against the odds. And yet, through all the hardships, Malik had found solace in books. In them, he saw a world that was bigger than the one he lived in. He saw possibilities that seemed so far away, yet so incredibly close. His childhood had been defined by an unspoken understanding that things were never going to be easy for him. But his mother's words echoed in his ears, you can be anything if you keep your mind focused. Malik had latched onto that advice with everything he had. At school, Malik had always been a bit of an outsider. He didn't talk much. He wasn't particularly popular, nor was he part of the in crowd. His peers tended to write him off as quiet, unremarkable, and that suited Malik just fine. He didn't need their approval. He had one goal, to prove to himself, and to the world, that he was more than just a statistic. Though he had always excelled in his studies, Malik's quiet nature made it hard for people to see his brilliance. Teachers at his old school often dismissed him as just another kid from the wrong side of town. His classmates, too, didn't know what to make of him. He didn't fit in with the troublemakers, but he also didn't fit in with the overachievers. He was a silent observer, content to watch the world spin around him. Yet, his intelligence was undeniable. Malik didn't just memorize facts, he understood them on a level that most people couldn't grasp. His ability to connect dots, to solve problems, was something extraordinary. He had an innate gift, a genius IQ that could change his life if only people could see it. But in his old school, that talent was hidden behind the veil of assumptions. Teachers didn't have time to see him as more than another student in an overcrowded classroom. They couldn't see past his quiet demeanor and his humble background. When Malik's mother had told him they were moving to a new school, Malik had been apprehensive. A new start sounded good in theory, but he knew the reality. No matter where he went, he'd still be the same Malik, the quiet kid from the tough neighborhood, judged before he even opened his mouth. His mother, ever hopeful, had believed that this school, Lincoln High, would offer him a better chance. It was a school with more resources, better facilities, and a different demographic. Perhaps, here, he could make something of himself. Perhaps here, the world would finally see him for who he really was. But now, after just a week at Lincoln High, Malik wasn't so sure. He had already sensed the skepticism in Mr. Adams' eyes, the subtle doubt that lingered whenever he spoke or remained silent. Malik could feel it, even if no one had said a word. It wasn't just about the schoolwork. It was about what people thought of him before they even knew him. "Are you going to speak up today, Malik?" Mr. Adams had asked him earlier that morning, though there had been no malice in his tone. It was the kind of question that felt more like an expectation than a genuine inquiry. Malik had simply nodded, his usual response. He had learned long ago that silence was often easier than speaking out, especially when no one expected you to be anything more than what they saw on the surface. At his old school, he had gotten used to being overlooked. But at Lincoln High, it felt different. The stakes were higher. People had higher expectations. If only they knew that under his quiet exterior was a mind that could do things no one could imagine. If only Mr. Adams understood that, instead of assuming Malik wasn't capable of much, he might be surprised at how much he had to offer. But for now, Malik didn't say anything. He didn't raise his hand in class or participate in discussions. He didn't draw attention to himself. Instead, he focused on his notes, scribbling down everything Mr. Adams was saying. As much as the teacher seemed to doubt him, Malik knew that knowledge would be his shield. If people wouldn't listen to his voice, they could at least listen to his mind. Malik knew he was biding his time. The right moment would come. And when it did, Mr. Adams would realize just how wrong he was to doubt him. The days passed slowly at Lincoln High, and as much as Malik had hoped that things might improve, they seemed to be getting worse. Despite his quiet brilliance, it was hard to ignore the growing tension between him and Mr. Adams. The teacher's subtle doubts were starting to show, and Malik could feel the weight of them on his shoulders. Every time Mr. Adams called on him, there was this expectation, this invisible challenge that Malik wasn't sure he was ready to face. It wasn't that Mr. Adams was overtly rude or dismissive, on the contrary, he was polite and professional. But there was always a certain skepticism in his eyes, as if he were waiting for Malik to prove himself in some dramatic way. It was a feeling that Malik knew all too well, a sense of being constantly judged by people who couldn't see past his quiet demeanor or his background. "Malik," Mr. Adams called out one afternoon, his voice cutting through the class like a sharp knife. "Can you explain how the Treaty of Versailles contributed to the start of World War II?" The class went silent. Everyone's eyes shifted toward Malik, and for a brief moment, he could feel the weight of their gazes. It wasn't the first time Mr. Adams had called on him, but this time, it felt different. The teacher's tone was sharp, almost challenging, as if he had already made up his mind about Malik's abilities. Malik paused, his fingers resting on the edge of his desk. He had studied the topic thoroughly. He could have answered the question with ease. But something about the way Mr. Adams was looking at him made him hesitate. There was a flicker of doubt in his chest, a whisper telling him that if he answered wrong, it would only reinforce the teacher's negative perception of him. He cleared his throat. The Treaty of Versailles, he began slowly, created economic instability in Germany. It placed heavy reparations on the country, causing widespread resentment. This fueled the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who promised to restore Germany's strength. The treaty's terms ultimately led to a destabilized Europe, setting the stage for World War II. Mr. Adams' expression didn't change. He simply nodded, as if expecting Malik to give that answer. "Correct," he said, though his voice lacked the enthusiasm he gave to other students. "But next time, try to elaborate more. There's more to the story than just the basics." Malik's heart sank. He had given a solid answer, yet it still wasn't good enough. He could feel the subtle judgment in the teacher's response. More to the story. Malik thought. Is he really expecting me to do more than just answer the question correctly? As the class continued, Malik's frustration grew. It wasn't about the assignment or the class, but the constant feeling that Mr. Adams wasn't seeing him for who he truly was. He wasn't just another student in the room. He wasn't just a kid from a tough neighborhood trying to fit in. He was different, and he had something special to offer. But Mr. Adams didn't seem to get it. The tension between them escalated over the next few weeks. Every time Malik answered a question or made a point, Mr. Adams seemed to find a way to subtly undermine him. It wasn't anything overt. It was just the way he would brush off Malik's contributions, or the way his answers seemed to never fully satisfy the teacher's expectations. One afternoon, after another frustrating lecture, Malik walked out of class and found himself in the hallway, leaning against a locker. His thoughts raced. Why did it feel like he was invisible? Why couldn't Mr. Adams see the potential in him? "Hey, Malik, you alright?" He turned around to see his friend, Carlos, standing behind him. Carlos was one of the few people at Lincoln High who actually seemed to care about him. Unlike the other students who saw Malik as quiet or distant, Carlos had always made an effort to include him, to draw him out of his shell. "Yeah, I'm fine," Malik replied, trying to hide the frustration in his voice. "Just, school stuff." Carlos raised an eyebrow, sensing that something was wrong. "That history class again, huh? Mr. Adams giving you a hard time?" Malik didn't respond immediately. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk about it, it was just that he wasn't sure how to explain the feeling. "I don't know, man," he said finally. "It's just, every time I try to show him I know what I'm talking about, he acts like it's not enough. Like he's waiting for me to mess up." Carlos frowned. "You're smarter than that, Malik. You know it, I know it. And Mr. Adams? He'll come around. Maybe he's just not used to seeing someone like you in his class." Malik sighed, looking down at the floor. "Maybe. But it's not just that. It's like, I don't even know how to explain it. I'm not looking for him to like me or anything, but I just wish he'd see what I can do. I want him to see me as more than just, this quiet kid." Carlos put a hand on his shoulder. "He'll see it, Malik. Trust me. It'll take time, but when he does, he's gonna be shocked. And when that moment comes, you're going to show him just how wrong he was about you." Malik managed a small smile, though the doubt still lingered in his chest. Carlos was right in a way. He had to keep going, keep proving himself. But there was a gnawing feeling deep inside, something telling him that no matter what he did, it might never be enough for Mr. Adams. The next day in class, as Mr. Adams gave another lecture on the geopolitical landscape leading up to World War II, Malik couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. He knew that he couldn't let the teacher's doubt define him. If anything, it was fuel, a reminder of why he needed to keep pushing forward, even when others couldn't see his worth. Because Malik wasn't just any student. He was someone who was about to show the world just how much he could truly achieve. And it all started with this moment. The moment where Mr. Adams' doubt would collide with the brilliance Malik had been hiding all along. The week passed quickly, and Malik found himself trapped in the same routine. He sat through Mr. Adams' lectures, trying to pay attention, but the teacher's dismissive attitude toward him kept tugging at his thoughts. It wasn't just the academic frustration, it was the weight of being misunderstood, of feeling like he had to prove his worth to everyone, especially to the one person who was supposed to believe in him. Malik had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this situation was different. The more he tried to engage, the more Mr. Adams seemed to distance himself from him. The class had moved on to a unit about the Cold War, but Malik's mind was still on the nagging feeling that he was invisible. But the universe, it seemed, was ready to intervene. One afternoon, Mr. Adams made an announcement that shook the entire class. "We're going to have a surprise quiz tomorrow," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "It will cover everything we've learned this semester so far. You'd better be prepared." The class groaned in unison, but Mr. Adams held up his hand to silence them. "Don't worry," he added. "It won't be that bad. But I do expect everyone to do well. And Malik," he said, turning his gaze toward Malik, "I'm sure you'll be able to handle this." Malik froze. There it was again, the challenge. The skepticism laced in every word, as if Mr. Adams was testing him, waiting for him to fail. Malik's jaw clenched. He knew what he had to do. This quiz wasn't just about history. It was about proving himself, to Mr. Adams and to everyone else who had ever doubted him. That night, Malik stayed up late, poring over his notes. He wasn't going to let this be another situation where he was written off. He'd studied the textbook, reviewed his notes, and even went through online resources, making sure he understood every detail. This quiz was going to be different. He wasn't going to let Mr. Adams, or anyone else, underestimate him again. The next morning, as he walked into history class, Malik felt a quiet sense of determination. He could feel the nervous energy in the room as the other students filed in, some of them already glancing at their notes one last time. But Malik was calm. He knew the material, and more importantly, he was ready to show what he was capable of. Mr. Adams entered the room and handed out the quiz papers. The moment he placed one on Malik's desk, Malik looked at the paper with a sharp focus, reading each question carefully. The quiz was designed to test not just factual knowledge, but the ability to analyze and draw connections between events. And that, Malik knew, was his strength. The questions were tough, far tougher than the usual quizzes at Lincoln High. But Malik didn't hesitate. He answered each one with precision, his pen moving quickly across the page as he recalled the intricate details of history. For each question, he offered not just facts, but insights. He connected the dots between economic policies, political ideologies, and social movements, demonstrating a deep understanding of the subject. As he reached the final question, Malik paused. It was an essay prompt, one that required students to write about the long-term effects of the Cold War on modern-day global politics. Malik's mind immediately went to the heart of the matter, the rise of global superpowers, the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, the ways in which the Cold War's legacy still influenced international relations today. Malik wrote with passion, pulling from everything he had learned over the years. He didn't just answer the question, he analyzed it, explored it from multiple angles, and brought in his own perspective. It was the kind of answer that someone who truly understood the complexity of history would give. When he finished, Malik sat back in his chair and glanced at the clock. There were still 10 minutes left in the period, but he didn't need to double-check his work. He knew he had done well. Mr. Adams had been walking around the room, scanning the students' progress, but as he neared Malik's desk, he stopped. Malik's paper was already in front of him, and for the first time in weeks, Mr. Adams hesitated. He glanced down at the answers, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Malik," Mr. Adams began, but his voice trailed off as he read further. He seemed to be scanning the answers with more interest than he had shown Malik in weeks. His fingers brushed over the neatly written essay, the precision of the analysis, the depth of understanding. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, though his face remained calm. He didn't need Mr. Adams' approval. He had done the work. He had shown what he was capable of. But the anticipation of the teacher's reaction made it hard to stay still. Finally, after a long pause, Mr. Adams nodded. "All right, class. Time's up." He took the papers and returned to his desk, but Malik could feel the eyes of the room on him. Was this the moment? Was Mr. Adams finally going to see him as more than just a quiet student? As the class ended and the students gathered their things, Mr. Adams called Malik over. His voice, which had been so skeptical just a week ago, was now almost tentative. "Malik," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "You did well on the quiz. In fact, your answers were, well, impressive." Malik stood there, his hands clutching his books. He wasn't sure how to respond. Was this an apology? Was Mr. Adams admitting he had been wrong about him? "I didn't expect that," Mr. Adams continued, his gaze a little softer now. "You've clearly been keeping up with the material. I underestimated you." Malik's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. As he left the classroom, Malik felt a mix of emotions. It wasn't just about the quiz or Mr. Adams' acknowledgement. It was the realization that he could no longer hide in the shadows. He had shown everyone, including himself, what he was capable of. The journey had only just begun. And Mr. Adams? Malik could feel it now. The doubt had cracked. It had given way to something much more powerful, respect. The following week was one of those rare moments when everything seemed to fall into place. Malik could feel the shift in the air. Mr. Adams no longer cast the same skeptical gaze his way, and even the students who had barely noticed him before began to look at him differently. There was a newfound respect, a silent acknowledgement that Malik had something special. And yet, despite the relief that came with the change, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He hadn't won the battle yet, he had merely stepped onto the battlefield. It was Friday afternoon when the real test came. The day had started like any other, with Mr. Adams walking into the classroom and announcing that they would be having a class discussion on the impact of the Cold War on modern society. As usual, Malik sat quietly at his desk, waiting for the lecture to begin. His mind was clear, but there was an underlying anticipation building up within him. Today wasn't just about history. It was about something much more important, showing everyone, once and for all, who he really was. Mr. Adams began the discussion with his usual question, "So, how did the Cold War shape the world we live in today?" He turned toward the board and began writing key terms. But as the students started to answer, mostly with surface-level knowledge, regurgitating what they had read in the textbook, Malik felt a fire stirring inside him. It was the same frustration he'd felt in those earlier weeks, when no one seemed to see the depth of his understanding. He wasn't just going to sit by and let this moment pass him by. Without raising his hand, Malik stood up. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as every pair of eyes turned toward him. "Malik?" Mr. Adams said, his voice a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. "Do you have something to add?" Malik took a deep breath and began. "We talk about the Cold War like it's just a distant event in history, but it's not. Its impact is alive today. The global arms race, the rise of surveillance states, the spread of nuclear technology, these are all things that shape the world we live in. The Cold War wasn't just a battle between two superpowers, it was a war of ideologies that still divides nations today. And let's not forget how the proxy wars in Africa and Asia altered the political landscapes of entire continents, creating instability that's lasted for decades." The room was silent as Malik's words hung in the air. He was no longer just speaking from the textbook, he was connecting the dots in a way that no one had expected. He wasn't just repeating facts, he was showing them how history had unfolded and how it was still unfolding in real time. As he spoke, Malik's heart raced. He could feel the energy in the room shift, from surprise to awe. Even Mr. Adams, who had been standing at the front of the class with his arms crossed, seemed taken aback. Malik didn't stop there. He continued, breaking down the modern-day implications of the Cold War with the same clarity and passion he had shown on the quiz. Finally, as he finished, he glanced around at the students, who were now looking at him with wide eyes. There was a silence in the room, one that lasted only a few moments but felt like an eternity. Then, Mr. Adams spoke, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Malik. I had no idea you were capable of that." The words hit Malik like a wave, but he didn't let them throw him off balance. He had known all along what he was capable of. He just needed the right moment to show it. Mr. Adams hesitated, glancing around the room. "Class, I think we've just witnessed something remarkable. Malik has given us a perspective on the Cold War that none of us expected." He paused, then turned to Malik directly. "You should be proud of yourself." Malik felt a rush of emotions flood through him. Pride, yes, but also relief. He had done it. For the first time, he wasn't being seen as just the quiet kid from the wrong side of town. He was being seen for who he really was, someone capable of greatness. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the other students, a boy named Jake who had always been quick to voice his opinions, raised his hand. "I don't know, Mr. Adams," Jake said, his tone skeptical. "It just feels like Malik is trying to make himself seem smarter than the rest of us. I mean, he never speaks in class until now, and then he comes out with all this stuff, acting like he knows more than everyone else. Doesn't that seem a little off?" Malik's heart skipped a beat, the moment of victory slipping through his fingers. He looked toward Jake, who was leaning back in his chair with a smug expression, as if daring anyone to disagree with him. For a brief moment, Malik's old insecurities flared up. He could feel the familiar sting of being judged, of being seen as an outsider. The class had shifted from awe to discomfort, the air now thick with tension. Mr. Adams seemed to sense the change in the room, and his face darkened. "Jake," he said, his voice firm, "what Malik did was demonstrate his understanding of the topic. That's what we're here to do, challenge each other, learn from each other. If you feel that's off, perhaps you should reflect on why that is." Malik wasn't sure if he felt relieved or more exposed. The words Mr. Adams had spoken were meant to defend him, but they had left him feeling more vulnerable. In that moment, Malik realized something. It wasn't just about proving his worth to Mr. Adams or to the class. It was about proving it to himself. He had known he was different. He had known that he had the potential to be great. But today, he had seen how quickly others would try to undermine him, how easily people could dismiss someone who wasn't like them. Malik could no longer hide behind the shadows of self-doubt. This was his reality now, and he had to own it. As the class ended, Mr. Adams approached Malik again, his expression a mix of regret and admiration. "Malik," he said quietly, I was wrong about you. You're not just another student in my class. You're something special. I can see that now." Malik nodded, accepting the teacher's apology without words. The emotional roller coaster of the moment had left him drained, but he knew he had made his point. It wasn't about proving himself to anyone else anymore. He had already done that. Now, the challenge was to keep pushing forward, to continue proving to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. The journey had only just begun. The weeks that followed that pivotal day were filled with a mixture of quiet triumph and lingering uncertainty. Malik had finally earned Mr. Adams' respect, but there was still a deep sense of tension in the air. The other students treated him with more caution, even admiration, but there were still whispers in the hallways, still those who doubted his sudden rise to prominence. Malik didn't mind the whispers, he had learned to ignore them over the years. He had bigger things to focus on now. His academic performance had improved, and he was beginning to feel a sense of belonging in the classroom that he had never felt before. For the first time, he wasn't just skating by. He was thriving. But despite his success, there was something nagging at the back of his mind, a question he couldn't shake. What was it about him that made people doubt him so much in the first place? Why had Mr. Adams, someone he had come to respect, been so quick to dismiss his potential? It was during one of those quiet moments in class, after the bell rang, when most students were already packing up to leave, that Malik's curiosity would finally get the best of him. He waited until the classroom had mostly emptied out, then approached Mr. Adams' desk, where the teacher was finishing up some paperwork. "Mr. Adams?" Malik's voice was hesitant but firm, the tone of someone who was ready for an answer. Mr. Adams looked up, surprised by the directness of Malik's question. "Yes, Malik. What's on your mind?" Malik took a deep breath, fighting the lump in his throat. "I need to ask you something. Something that's been bothering me for a while. Why did you doubt me at the beginning of the year? Why was it so easy for you to write me off as just another student from a bad background?" The words came out before he could stop them, the question tumbling from his lips like an avalanche of emotion. He hadn't meant to sound accusatory, but the truth had been building inside him for so long, it had to come out. Mr. Adams froze, his pen still in his hand, and for a moment, there was a long silence. It was like the entire world had paused as the tension in the air thickened. He finally set the pen down, his expression softening, and looked Malik in the eye. "I see," he said quietly. "I guess I owe you an explanation." Malik's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. He had expected an excuse, maybe even a brush-off. But this was different. Mr. Adams leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. "It wasn't just you, Malik. It was something I've been carrying for a long time. I'm going to be honest with you. I've had trouble with students from your background. I've seen so many talented kids come through here, and most of them, they don't make it. They get caught up in the wrong things. Their potential gets wasted. And, truth be told, I didn't want to get my hopes up for you. I didn't want to invest in you only to watch you fall behind like so many others." Malik's mind reeled. His chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. Was that it? Was that all it took for Mr. Adams to dismiss him, to stereotype him because of where he came from? "I didn't mean to," Mr. Adams continued, his voice quieter now. "I'm not proud of it. But I let my own biases cloud my judgment. I saw the way you kept to yourself, the way you never really participated, and I assumed the worst. I'm ashamed to admit that, but it's the truth." Malik stood there, processing the weight of Mr. Adams' words. For a moment, everything seemed to fall into place, the subtle dismissals, the way his potential had been overlooked, the way he had been made to feel invisible for so long. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and Malik could finally see the deeper currents at play. Mr. Adams wasn't a bad person. He wasn't malicious. He was simply trapped in his own prejudices, shaped by years of experience that had led him to believe that students like Malik were destined to fail. But there was something else, something more important, that Malik realized in that moment. It wasn't just about Mr. Adams. It was about everyone who had ever doubted him. About every teacher, every classmate, every person who had written him off because of where he came from or how he looked. They had all fallen into the same trap of assumptions, and it wasn't just unfair, it was damaging. Malik felt his anger begin to shift, from a burning resentment to something more productive. This was his moment to not only prove Mr. Adams wrong but to prove to himself that he was more than the world had made him believe. "Thank you for being honest with me," Malik said, his voice steady now, though the weight of the conversation still hung in the air. "I get it. But I'm not going to be that statistic. I'm not going to let anyone define me by where I'm from or what people expect of me." Mr. Adams looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and admiration. "I can see that now," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry. I should have seen it sooner. You're capable of so much more, Malik." "I've seen that now." Malik nodded, accepting the apology without hesitation. There was no need for further words. The truth had been laid bare between them, and with that truth came a new understanding. As Malik turned to leave, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was only the beginning. The road ahead would still be full of obstacles, full of moments where he'd have to prove himself over and over again. But now, for the first time, he understood that his journey wasn't about winning anyone's approval. It was about showing the world that he was worthy of being seen, of being valued for who he truly was. And as he stepped out of the classroom and into the hallway, Malik knew one thing for certain: he was going to keep pushing forward. No matter what. The days after the conversation with Mr. Adams were a mix of relief and determination. Malik had heard the apology, but it wasn't just about the apology. It was about the knowledge that he had earned the right to be seen. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was Malik, a student with a future ahead of him, a future that no one, not even the people who had doubted him, could take away. But despite the small victories in the classroom, Malik couldn't shake the reality of what still awaited him outside those walls. He was still living in the same neighborhood, still surrounded by the same challenges. And while school had become a place of opportunity, his home life remained complex and filled with struggles that no academic achievement could erase. Malik's mother, Yolanda, had always been his biggest supporter, but the weight of her own difficulties was starting to show. Work was always hard to come by, and with Malik's younger brother, Tyler, now old enough to start school, the financial strain on their family was only increasing. Yolanda tried to hide her worry, but Malik could see it in the lines on her face and the tiredness in her eyes. She would smile and say everything was fine, but he knew better. Malik didn't want to burden her more than she already was, but he also couldn't ignore the reality of their situation. He had been thinking a lot about his future, about the path he was on. College was a distant dream, something that seemed unreachable for someone from his background. Yet, after everything that had happened in Mr. Adams' class, after everything he had proven to himself and to others, Malik started to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was possible. That night, as Malik sat at the kitchen table, his textbook spread out in front of him, he glanced up to find his mother standing in the doorway. Yolanda had just come home from another long shift, and her shoulders were slumped as she leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "You're up late, Malik," she said softly, her voice tired but warm. "I'm almost done," he replied, not looking up from the page. "Just finishing up some homework." Yolanda smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You know, I don't want you staying up too late. You need your rest. You've got a lot of potential, but you can't burn out." Malik nodded. He knew she was right. He had always pushed himself hard, not wanting to disappoint her, but also wanting to escape the cycle he saw around him. Sometimes, it felt like his life was a game of survival, and his mind raced with thoughts of how he could change his future, how he could make sure his mother and brother would never have to struggle the way they did. But that night, something inside him clicked. "Mom," Malik said quietly, looking up from his books. "Do you think I could actually get out of here? Go to college, I mean. Do you think it's possible for someone like me?" Yolanda blinked, as if the question caught her off guard. Then, her gaze softened, and she stepped into the room, sitting beside him at the table. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to, Malik," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "But I also know it's not going to be easy. You've got a lot of challenges ahead. You'll have to fight for every opportunity. But you're already fighting. You've shown me that much." Malik felt a swell of emotion rise up within him. His mother's unwavering belief in him was the one thing that had kept him going all these years, but now, it felt like more. It felt like the foundation he needed to build something greater than himself. "I want to fight for it," he said, determination settling in his voice. "I want to make it happen. I know it won't be easy, but I'm ready. I've got to do something with this gift, this chance I've got." Yolanda placed a hand on his arm, a reassuring touch. "You'll find a way, Malik. I know you will. And no matter what happens, I'll always be here, cheering you on. Malik smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and resolve. This was it. The moment when he knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be about just proving others wrong. It would be about proving to himself that he was worth the fight. That he could break the mold that others had put him in. The next day at school, the momentum from his conversation with Mr. Adams still carried him. The other students were slowly warming to him. There was a respect now, an acknowledgement of his abilities. Even Jake, who had been one of his biggest skeptics, had started to look at him differently. It wasn't that they had become best friends, far from it, but there was a mutual understanding now. People weren't judging him by where he came from anymore. They were seeing him for what he could do. However, despite the progress, there was still one major hurdle to overcome. Malik knew that he needed to start planning for his future. He couldn't rely on the fleeting moments of validation from school. It was time to take action. College applications, scholarships, it was all ahead of him, and the thought of it made his stomach turn with a mix of excitement and anxiety. How could he possibly compete with students from wealthier backgrounds who had parents paying for tutors and test prep classes? How could he afford to go to college when he didn't have the money? But then, Malik remembered something. The conversations with Mr. Adams. The quiet moments of reflection. His mother's unwavering support. Malik wasn't just going to follow the path that others expected him to take. He was going to carve his own way. And that way was going to lead him to the future he had always dreamed of, no matter how steep the climb. As the bell rang at the end of the school day, Malik made his way to the library, determined to do some research. This was just the beginning. He had no idea how long the road ahead would be, but one thing was clear, he wasn't going to stop until he reached the top. Malik's journey had only just begun, but he was already feeling the weight of the choices that lay ahead of him. The hallway buzzed with the usual after-school chatter as students rushed out the door, eager to get home, to their jobs, or to practice. For Malik, though, his mind was elsewhere. The library was where he felt most at home now, a quiet sanctuary where he could focus on the goals he had set for himself. He had spent the last few weeks researching colleges and scholarships, trying to find opportunities that would fit both his aspirations and his reality. He knew the odds were stacked against him, his grades were good, but they weren't stellar, his extracurriculars were few, and his family's financial situation was far from ideal. But the more Malik dug, the more he realized that there were opportunities out there. Scholarships for first-generation students. Financial aid programs for students from low-income backgrounds. And there were also programs specifically for students who had overcome adversity. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance Malik wasn't about to pass up. The next few weeks were a blur. Malik spent almost every free moment in the library, researching and filling out applications. He stayed late after school, scribbling essays and revising them over and over again. He even started reaching out to teachers for letters of recommendation, including Mr. Adams, who, despite his earlier doubts, had agreed without hesitation to write one for him. But even as Malik poured his heart into his applications, there was a lingering anxiety that gnawed at him. What if it wasn't enough? What if the scholarships didn't come through? What if he couldn't afford the cost of even applying to college? The thought of falling short, of all this effort being for nothing, terrified him. One afternoon, as Malik was sitting at a computer in the library, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around to see Jake standing behind him, an expression of curiosity mixed with something else, something like respect. "You're really serious about this college thing, huh?" Jake said, leaning on the back of the chair. Malik nodded, glancing at the college application open on his screen. "Yeah. I don't have a choice. I want to make something of myself." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's cool. I didn't think you'd be into all this academic stuff." Malik chuckled. "Most people don't." There was a moment of silence between them, then Jake sighed. "I guess I was wrong about you. I thought you were just another kid trying to skate through school, but I see now that you've got a real plan. A real future. Malik looked up at Jake, not quite sure how to respond. He had never expected this kind of acknowledgement from Jake, who had always been one of the students who would have rather skipped class than buckle down and study. Thanks, Malik said, his voice sincere. I'm just doing what I have to do. You're gonna make it, Jake said with a nod. I'm rooting for you. Malik smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. For the first time, he felt like people were seeing him for who he truly was, not just who they thought he was. But even as Malik started to feel the sense of support from his peers, the reality of his situation never let him forget the stakes. The next day, when he got home, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, a letter in her hand. She looked up at him as he walked in, her eyes tired but hopeful. Malik, come sit down. We need to talk. Malik's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen his mother look so serious. He sat down beside her, anxiety creeping in. What's wrong, Mom? He asked. She handed him the letter. It was from a local scholarship organization, one Malik had applied to just weeks before. The letter was long, the type of formal letter that Malik had learned to dread. His fingers shook as he opened it, scanning the text quickly. His eyes widened when he saw the words award and selection. Mom, Malik's voice cracked as he looked at her. I got it. I got the scholarship. Yolanda's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him. I knew you could do it, baby. I knew you could. Malik's mind raced. The scholarship wasn't the full amount needed to cover his tuition, but it was a significant contribution. It was a step, the first step, toward making his dream a reality. It was more than he could have hoped for. And it was all because he had fought for it. He had put in the work, believed in himself, and refused to let anything hold him back. As the days went by, Malik's sense of purpose grew stronger. He had more than just a scholarship now. He had a plan, and he had a community that believed in him, people who saw him for who he was and not where he came from. But even as things started to fall into place, Malik knew the hardest part was still ahead of him. College was just the beginning. The path to success would still be full of challenges, obstacles that would test him in ways he could never anticipate. He spent the next few weeks making final decisions about his college choices. He was still unsure about which one to choose, the local community college with a generous financial aid package, or the prestigious university that offered him a spot but had a price tag that was almost too much to handle. Late one night, as Malik sat in front of his laptop, the weight of his decision pressing on his shoulders, he remembered something his mom had told him. Whatever you choose, make sure it's a choice that makes you proud. No one else can define your future. That was when Malik realized that he didn't need to make this decision alone. He had his mom's support, his teacher's backing, and now, for the first time, he had the confidence to follow his own path. He wasn't just doing this for a scholarship, or for a degree. He was doing it for himself, to prove that he was more than just a statistic. With that clarity, Malik made his decision. He was going to apply to the university, the one that had given him the chance to prove himself. Because Malik knew now that the road ahead, though difficult, would be worth every step. And no matter where it led, he was ready. As the weeks passed, Malik's anticipation began to build. The weight of his decision to apply to the prestigious university was both thrilling and daunting. Every morning he woke up, he felt a fire igniting inside him, pushing him to keep going, keep fighting. But with that excitement came the ever-present fear of failure. Every time he checked his phone for emails, he wondered, what if they say no? What if I'm just not enough? It was a fear he couldn't shake, no matter how much success he had already tasted. The scholarship, the approval from his teachers, and even the validation from people like Jake all meant something. But still, the thought of rejection from the university loomed over him like a storm cloud. Malik knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. College was more than just a dream now, it was becoming a reality he had to prepare for. He had grown up with the understanding that everything came at a cost, and nothing was ever given freely. That was the mindset that had driven him for years, through late-night studying and relentless self-doubt. He had always believed that hard work and determination were his only tools for success. Still, as the day for his university decision arrived, Malik felt his heart race in his chest. He had submitted all of his applications, essays, recommendation letters, transcripts, but now came the moment of truth. His inbox was quiet for what felt like hours. Then, right before he was about to give up hope for the day, he saw it, a new email notification. His hand trembled as he clicked open the message. His eyes scanned the subject line, and his breath caught in his throat. "Congratulations, Malik. You've been accepted to the University of Chicago." A wave of relief flooded over him, followed by disbelief. The next few moments felt like an out-of-body experience. The excitement, the shock, and the joy were overwhelming. He blinked several times, reading the words again to make sure they hadn't been a mistake. Malik sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. He had done it. He had made it. He had been accepted. His heart pounded in his chest as he allowed the weight of the moment to sink in. After a few minutes, Malik finally stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wanted to scream, to celebrate, but he knew that the real journey was just beginning. He had earned this spot, but he still had to prove that he belonged there. He rushed into the living room, where his mom was sitting, watching TV. She looked up as Malik came in, his face beaming with excitement. Her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to realization as she saw the look in his eyes. "Malik, what's wrong?" Yolanda asked, her voice tentative. I got in. I got into the University of Chicago, Mom." Malik's voice cracked with emotion. Yolanda's eyes widened in disbelief before she jumped up from the couch, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Oh my God, you did it, baby. You really did it." The two of them held onto each other for a long moment, letting the weight of the accomplishment sink in. Yolanda was crying, tears of joy streaming down her face. Malik could barely believe it himself. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was for his mother, who had supported him every step of the way. It was for his family, who had sacrificed so much to give him a shot at a better life. As the days passed, Malik's thoughts began to shift. The thrill of his acceptance soon gave way to the realization that he was about to embark on a new, uncharted path. College was a dream, but it also came with new challenges. He couldn't ignore the financial burden that would weigh on him. The university might have accepted him, but it didn't guarantee he would be able to attend without crippling debt. But Malik had always known that nothing came easy. This was his chance to make a life that was his own, and he wasn't about to let anything stop him. Malik's phone rang a few days later, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mr. Adams. "Malik," Mr. Adams' voice came through, warm but serious, "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. The scholarship, the acceptance letter, it's all earned. I know you'll make the most of it." Malik smiled, feeling a sense of warmth that only Mr. Adams' words could bring. "Thank you, Mr. Adams. You've been one of the people who believed in me from the start. That means everything. Just don't forget what you're capable of. You've got more than just brains, you've got heart, Malik. And that's going to take you far." The words hit Malik deeper than he expected. They weren't just words of encouragement. They were a reminder that no matter how much he doubted himself, there were people out there who believed in him, who saw him as more than just his circumstances. The next few weeks were a blur of excitement, uncertainty, and preparation. Malik visited the university campus, soaking in the sights and sounds of a world he had only dreamed of entering. He saw students from all walks of life, some who seemed so confident, others who were struggling just like him. He felt both out of place and like he was exactly where he needed to be. Malik couldn't shake the doubts that still lingered in his mind. He knew he had earned his place at the university, but would he be able to keep up with the other students? He wasn't from a wealthy background. He didn't have access to the same resources. And most of all, he didn't know if he was truly ready for this new world. As Malik sat on the steps of his porch that evening, watching the sunset, his mind wandered. He thought about how far he had come, about the people who had supported him, and about all the people who had doubted him along the way. He thought about the path ahead, and what it might look like. It was scary, uncertain, but it was also his path. And as he closed his eyes, he realized something. I may not know exactly how this journey will unfold, but I know I'm ready to face it. I've already proved I can do the impossible. The first day of college arrived faster than Malik had anticipated. It felt like just yesterday that he had been sitting in the library, nervously filling out applications, unsure if he would ever make it this far. Now, here he was, standing on the campus of the University of Chicago, the place that had once seemed so distant and out of reach. He stood at the edge of the quad, watching the students flow around him in a sea of diversity and purpose. Some walked in pairs, laughing and chatting, while others moved with the single-minded focus of students already in their groove. There was an energy in the air that was both exhilarating and intimidating. Malik felt like he was both part of this world and completely outside of it. The nerves were creeping up again. His mind raced. Was he really ready for this? Would he be able to keep up with these students, many of whom came from backgrounds far wealthier and more privileged than his own? But Malik didn't have time to dwell on these thoughts for long. As he walked toward the main building, he was distracted by the towering ivy-covered walls of the campus, the buzz of new students and returning ones chatting excitedly about their summer breaks, and the overwhelming sense of possibility in the air. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was stepping into a space where anything could happen, and he had a say in how it would unfold. Malik arrived at his first lecture hall early, as he always did. He preferred to settle in before the class filled up, to give himself a moment of quiet before everything became a whirlwind. When he walked in, there were only a few students seated at their desks. He found a spot near the front, not wanting to waste time searching for an open seat later. As he sat down, his mind started to wander again. What if I can't do this? What if I don't belong here? He took a deep breath, shaking off the self-doubt. No. I belong here. I earned this spot. Before he could sink deeper into his thoughts, the professor walked in. A tall, middle-aged man with glasses, wearing a tweed jacket and a tie, he had a warm but no-nonsense demeanor. He introduced himself as Professor Parker, a professor of history. His voice was calm, but there was a confidence in the way he spoke that made Malik pay attention. Professor Parker started by talking about the course and what they would be studying. As he spoke, Malik felt the familiar feeling of excitement building inside him. The history lessons, the lectures, this was the kind of environment where he thrived. This was where he could learn, grow, and prove to everyone, including himself, that he was capable of achieving greatness. The class went on, and Malik found himself surprisingly at ease. For all his worries, he realized that college wasn't all that different from the classroom back at Lincoln High. Yes, the students were different, the expectations were higher, and the material was more challenging, but the essence was the same. It was about learning, about expanding your mind, and about pushing yourself to be better. By the time the lecture ended, Malik had already made a mental list of things he needed to do to keep on track, readings to catch up on, assignments to start, and professors to meet. It was overwhelming, but it was also energizing. He couldn't wait to dive in. As he left the classroom, Malik was surprised to see a few of his classmates lingering outside, chatting about the lecture. He recognized a few of them from the syllabus, but he hadn't had the chance to meet anyone yet. The anxiety he felt at the start of the day had been replaced by a sense of purpose, and now he knew that he needed to step out of his comfort zone. He walked up to a small group of students standing near the door. One of them, a tall girl with curly hair and a bright smile, turned to him. "Hey, you're in history, right? I saw you in class," she said, her voice friendly and inviting. Malik smiled. "Yeah, I am. First day nerves, you know." She laughed, nodding in agreement. "I get it. It's definitely a lot to take in. I'm Emma, by the way. I don't think we've met before." "Malik," he replied, extending a hand. "It's nice to meet you." A few other students introduced themselves, and they all began talking about the course and their expectations for the semester. Malik was amazed at how easy the conversation felt. These students weren't so different from the people he had known back home, they just had different opportunities, different backgrounds. And yet, they all shared the same nervousness about starting something new. By the end of the conversation, Malik had already exchanged contact information with a few of them, and Emma had invited him to join their study group. He hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. It was exactly what he needed, a chance to connect with others and build a support system early on. The next few days passed quickly as Malik settled into a routine. His classes were challenging, but not impossible. He made time to study, balancing his academics with the part-time job he had gotten at the campus bookstore. The work was hard, but Malik was used to hard work. It was the price he had to pay to make his dream come true. And then, one afternoon, as Malik sat in the library working on an essay for one of his classes, he heard a familiar voice. "Malik?" He looked up and saw Jake standing at the entrance, a grin on his face. "What are you doing here?" Malik asked, surprised. Jake shrugged. "Figured I'd check out the campus, maybe run into you. I know it's been a while since we talked." Malik smiled. "Yeah, I've been so caught up with everything. But it's good to see you. How's everything going back home?" Jake sat down next to him. "You know, things are going okay. I'm still trying to figure it out, but seeing you here, man, it's inspiring. You made it. I always thought you would, but it's still crazy to see." Malik looked at Jake, feeling a sense of pride. "Thanks, man. It means a lot." As they caught up, Malik realized that even though he had come a long way, there were still people who remembered him and who supported him, just like the people back home. And that made everything feel a little less daunting. By the end of the week, Malik was beginning to feel like he truly belonged. He wasn't just a kid from the wrong side of the tracks anymore. He was a student at the University of Chicago, a person with dreams, determination, and the skills to succeed. But as he continued to navigate his new life, one thing was certain: this was only the beginning of a much bigger journey, one that would test his resilience, his intellect, and his character. And Malik was ready for whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The weeks quickly began to blur together as Malik settled into his college routine. Classes were demanding, and the workload was unlike anything he had ever encountered before. Each day felt like a battle against time, and there were moments when the pressure seemed almost unbearable. But Malik wasn't one to back down. He had worked too hard to get here, and he wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, knock him off course. As Malik entered his second month at the University of Chicago, he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. No matter how much he tried to blend in, there was always something that reminded him of how different he was from the majority of his peers. The students he met came from affluent backgrounds, some even had family members who were alumni, and they often had more connections and resources than he could ever hope for. One day, after finishing a particularly grueling history lecture, Malik sat in the campus coffee shop, staring at the screen of his laptop. He had an essay to write, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but overhear the conversation at the next table, a group of students talking about their spring break plans. "I'm going to Cabo with my family," one of the girls said. We rented this amazing villa. My parents have connections there. I'm going to Paris for a few weeks, another student chimed in. We have a friend who owns a boutique, so I'll be shopping in all the exclusive places. Malik shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had always known that people like him, people who came from nothing, had to work harder, prove themselves more, but hearing conversations like this made it feel like an insurmountable wall was between him and the life he wanted. A few days later, Malik walked into his physics class, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over him. It was a small, intimate class, and the professor had a reputation for being tough. The students in this class were the best of the best, and Malik couldn't help but feel like he didn't quite belong. He had never had the same resources growing up, never attended the same prestigious private schools as many of his peers. And although his genius IQ had carried him far, there was always a voice in the back of his head reminding him that he didn't have the same pedigree. Malik took his seat, trying to shake off the feeling of being an impostor. He had already put in the work, completed the assignments, and aced the tests so far, but doubts lingered. As the professor began the lecture, Malik tried to focus, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of his insecurities. After class, Malik was walking to the library when he was stopped by one of his classmates, a guy named Ben. Ben was tall, athletic, and always seemed to be the center of attention in their physics class. "Hey, Malik, right?" Ben called out. "I was wondering if you wanted to join our study group this weekend. We're reviewing for the midterm, and I think you'd be a great addition." Malik was caught off guard. Sure. I'd be happy to join." Ben smiled. "Awesome. We meet at my place on Saturday. I'll send you the details." Malik walked away, his mind racing. Could this be the breakthrough I've been waiting for? He wasn't sure what motivated Ben to invite him, but it was the first time someone had actively sought him out to be part of their group. It was a small victory, but it meant something to Malik. Saturday came, and Malik walked into Ben's apartment, feeling slightly out of his element. The place was modern, spacious, and felt completely different from the modest apartment he shared with his mom. As he entered the study area, he was greeted by several other students. All of them looked like they belonged in this world. They had everything Malik didn't have growing up: money, privilege, and connections. But instead of letting those thoughts discourage him, Malik pushed them aside and focused on the task at hand. They were here to study. And he was good at this. In fact, Malik knew that he had a leg up on the others when it came to understanding complex concepts. He had always been naturally gifted in subjects like math and physics. This was where he thrived. As the study session began, Malik quickly found himself speaking up, answering questions with ease and offering explanations that impressed the group. It wasn't long before the others started to rely on him for guidance, asking him to clarify difficult concepts. Malik found himself in his element, and the more he contributed, the more confident he became. At the end of the study session, Ben clapped him on the back. "You're really good, Malik. Seriously, you should think about joining us more often." Malik smiled. "Thanks. I might just do that." That weekend was a turning point for Malik. For the first time since arriving at the university, he felt like he truly belonged. The study group was a place where his talents were recognized, where he wasn't just the kid from the wrong side of the tracks but someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best and brightest. But it wasn't just about the academic success, it was about the validation that he had something to offer, something that his background couldn't take away from him. The doubts that had haunted him began to fade, and a new sense of confidence took their place. On Monday, Malik walked into his physics class with a different attitude. He knew that this was just the beginning, that his journey was far from over, but he had finally begun to realize that he was more than capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. As the professor began the lecture, Malik sat up straighter, ready to dive into the material. He wasn't just learning for the sake of grades anymore, he was learning to prove something to himself, to show the world that no matter where you come from, you can make it. Malik wasn't just a student at the University of Chicago anymore. He was part of something bigger. And nothing, not even the doubts that had once held him back, could stop him from reaching his potential. Malik's newfound confidence from the study group carried him through the next few weeks. He continued to perform well in his classes and build stronger relationships with his peers. But college was far from easy, and Malik knew that he hadn't faced his biggest challenges yet. It was a crisp Wednesday morning when Malik walked into his calculus class. The lecture hall buzzed with chatter, students sitting in their usual spots, shuffling papers, and checking phones. The professor, Dr. Simmons, a stern woman in her mid-40s, with sharp glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, began to set up for class. Today was different, though. There was a certain tension in the air. As Malik settled into his seat, he noticed the anxious looks exchanged between some of the other students. Whispers filled the room, growing louder, until Dr. Simmons raised a hand. "All right, everyone, listen up," she said, her voice commanding silence. "Today, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of a regular lecture, we'll have a pop quiz. It's only 10 questions, but I want you to treat it seriously. It'll be a test of how well you've been keeping up with the material. I expect you to give it your best." The room erupted into murmurs, and Malik felt the familiar sting of nervousness crawl up his spine. A pop quiz was never a good thing, especially in a class as rigorous as calculus. He had kept up with the lectures, but this test, in the middle of the semester, felt like an unexpected curveball. "Stay calm," Malik told himself. "I've got this. I know the material." His hands were clammy, but he opened his notebook, glancing through the formulas and notes he'd made over the past few weeks. As Dr. Simmons handed out the quizzes, Malik forced himself to take deep breaths. He wasn't going to let anxiety take over. This was just another hurdle. A small one. When the quiz was placed in front of him, Malik scanned the questions. The first few were manageable, but as he worked through them, the difficulty level ramped up. Some of the problems required advanced steps and creative thinking that he hadn't anticipated. Malik could feel the clock ticking, the weight of the test growing heavier with each passing second. "Focus," Malik reminded himself, gritting his teeth as he moved on to the more complex questions. He paused, working through the steps methodically, calculating in his head, then scribbling down the answers with steady determination. His mind was sharp, but the time limit was pressing on him. He couldn't afford to waste precious seconds. As he reached the final question, a complicated multi-step problem that seemed impossible to solve on a single page, Malik's heart raced. He stared at the question for a long moment, trying to unravel the formula in his head. "Come on, you can do this." He began writing down the steps, his hand moving quickly, but the answer eluded him. He glanced around the room, catching sight of the other students. Some of them were typing rapidly on their calculators, while others were scribbling down last-minute formulas. Malik knew he didn't have a calculator with him, but he didn't need one. He had the skills. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Malik filled in the last part of the equation and wrote down the final answer. He glanced at the clock and saw that there were only a few minutes left. He double-checked his work, scanning each answer one last time, before handing in his quiz. As he left the room, Malik felt a mix of frustration and relief. He had done his best, but he wasn't entirely confident in the results. What if I missed something? What if I didn't do as well as I thought? He walked back to his dorm, the self-doubt creeping in again. He had worked so hard to get to this point, but this quiz, this sudden test of his abilities, had thrown him off. Was he really cut out for this? The next few days passed in a blur. Malik continued to study, keeping his head down and trying to stay focused. He didn't let himself dwell on the quiz for too long, but it was always in the back of his mind. He needed to know how he did. The waiting was unbearable. Finally, a week later, Dr. Simmons announced that the graded quizzes would be returned. Malik's heart raced as he waited for her to call out his name. When it was his turn, she handed him his paper with a look that was both stern and approving. Malik turned the quiz over, holding his breath. His eyes scanned the page, and to his surprise, he saw that he had received an A. Not just a passing grade, but an A. His stomach dropped. He couldn't believe it. He had aced the quiz. Malik sat back in his seat, allowing the news to sink in. He hadn't just passed the test, he had crushed it. This wasn't just a victory for his academic skills, this was proof that he belonged here. That his hard work, his perseverance, and his natural talents were enough to not just survive but to excel in this new world. As class ended, Malik packed up his things, still stunned by the result. He walked out of the lecture hall with a renewed sense of purpose, his head held a little higher. He wasn't just another student in the crowd anymore. He was Malik, a force to be reckoned with. Later that afternoon, Malik received a message from Ben, the student who had invited him to the study group. "Hey man, just saw the quiz results. You did awesome. I knew you had it in you." Malik smiled at the message, feeling a sense of pride. "Thanks, Ben. That means a lot." But as Malik walked to his next class, he also knew that this was just the beginning. The quiz was a victory, but there would be many more challenges ahead. The road to success wasn't going to be easy, and there were still people who doubted him, who saw him as an outsider. But Malik wasn't going to let that stop him. With each challenge, he was getting closer to proving that no matter where you start in life, with enough determination and hard work, you could achieve anything. And nothing was going to stand in his way. The following weeks after the quiz were a mix of triumph and tension for Malik. While the A on his calculus quiz had boosted his confidence, the reality of college life had started to feel more overwhelming. There were moments when Malik felt the weight of his ambitions pressing down on him, threatening to pull him under. But no matter how heavy the load, he refused to let it break him. He kept his focus, acing every other exam, taking part in his study groups, and immersing himself in the material. However, it wasn't just the academic pressures that were wearing him down. The more time Malik spent at the university, the more apparent the social barriers became. He had learned to navigate the classrooms and libraries, but outside of that, he still felt like an outsider. One evening, Malik was sitting at a cafe on campus, the hum of voices and clinking of coffee cups surrounding him. He was reading a textbook, trying to prepare for a chemistry test, but the noise and chatter in the room were starting to get to him. He could feel the weight of his isolation once again, a constant reminder of how different he was from most of his peers. He wasn't the rich, privileged student who went home to a lavish family estate every weekend. His home was his mom's small apartment in the city, far removed from the world of his classmates. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat and pushed his textbook aside. Just as he was about to check his phone for a distraction, his eyes landed on someone he hadn't seen in a while, Ms. Thompson, the older woman who had taught him in high school. She had been one of the few people who had believed in him back when no one else did. "Malik." Ms. Thompson called as she walked over to his table with a warm smile. She had a kind, maternal energy that always made Malik feel seen and heard. "What are you doing here? I thought I'd find you on campus one day. What's been going on?" Malik stood up to hug her, a genuine smile spreading across his face. It was always a relief to see someone who had known him before the pressures of college had started to mount. "Hey, Ms. Thompson. I'm just trying to study, but honestly, it's been a little overwhelming. I'm adjusting, but it's been a challenge." "I can imagine," she said with a nod, sitting down across from him. "The transition isn't easy for anyone, especially when you're trying to prove yourself in a world that doesn't always make space for you." Malik couldn't help but chuckle at her words. "You know it." "I do," she said, looking him in the eyes with that same knowing gaze she'd had when he was just a teenager. "But listen, Malik, I've seen you grow, and I know how hard you work. If anyone can succeed here, it's you. Don't let the pressure get to you." You've got what it takes. Her words hit Malik in a place he hadn't realized needed attention. He had been so focused on the hurdles ahead of him that he hadn't given himself the credit he deserved. I've got what it takes, he repeated in his mind. The reassurance from someone who truly believed in him, who saw his potential even when he didn't see it in himself, brought a wave of calm over him. Thanks, Ms. Thompson. I needed to hear that, Malik said, his voice filled with gratitude. They spent the next few hours talking about life, memories of high school, and how far Malik had come since then. As she left, she gave him one final piece of advice: Malik, always remember that the road less traveled is hard, but it's also the one that leads to the most rewarding places. Stay true to yourself. That night, Malik couldn't shake the weight of her words. Maybe he had been so focused on the challenges ahead of him that he had forgotten to appreciate how far he had come. He had always been the kid who wasn't supposed to make it, the one who didn't fit the mold, but here he was, thriving in a place where most people like him never even got the chance to be. The next day, Malik woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He was still an outsider in many ways, but he was also carving out a space for himself, one step at a time. His studies were going well, and his reputation among his peers was growing. Ben, from the study group, had even started to call him his study buddy, and they often worked together late into the evenings. The group had also expanded, with several others reaching out to join, seeing Malik as an invaluable part of their success. One afternoon, Malik was walking to class when he ran into another familiar face. This time, it was Jordan, the student who had questioned Malik's abilities during their first week of class. They had crossed paths a few times since then, but this time, Jordan was looking at him differently. There was a hesitant respect in his eyes. "Hey, Malik," Jordan said, pausing in front of him. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what I said earlier this semester. I just wanted to apologize. I didn't realize how wrong I was. You've really proven yourself in class." Malik blinked, caught off guard. The apology wasn't something he had expected, but he wasn't going to turn it down. "No hard feelings, man. I get it," Malik replied, offering a smile. "I've been working hard, and I guess that's showing." Jordan nodded, a smile forming on his face. "Yeah, definitely. Keep it up, man." As Malik walked away, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. The people who had doubted him were slowly starting to come around. But the most significant change wasn't the way they saw him, it was the way he saw himself. He wasn't just a scholarship student, an outsider, or someone who had to prove his worth. He was Malik, a force to be reckoned with, and his time to shine was just beginning. Later that evening, as Malik sat down to study with Ben, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He was surrounded by people who believed in him, by a support system that had grown stronger with every passing day. His future was still uncertain, but Malik was ready for whatever came next. The storm was finally starting to clear, and he was standing tall, ready to face the calm that followed. The weeks following his encounter with Jordan had been quieter, more reflective. Malik had settled into a rhythm at university, balancing his academic workload and social life with relative ease. The study group continued to be a source of support, and his grades were holding strong. However, despite the external calm, there was an underlying tension building inside him, a battle that he couldn't ignore for much longer. It wasn't the exams or the homework that was beginning to feel overwhelming. It was something deeper, something that had been festering beneath the surface since he arrived at the university. Malik had always known he was different, that his journey here hadn't been a typical one. But as time went on, he started to realize how much he was still fighting against, not just academically, but in the way he was perceived by others. The whispers, the looks, the subtle comments that lingered just out of earshot, they had all begun to wear on him. The system wasn't built for students like Malik. He wasn't just another face in the crowd, he was constantly aware of the invisible line separating him from his peers. He felt it when his ideas were dismissed in class discussions. He felt it when his contributions were downplayed, as if the professors couldn't quite see past his background. It wasn't overt racism, but it was there, quietly undermining his sense of belonging. And that sense of alienation had reached a boiling point that afternoon. Malik was walking back to his dorm after class when he spotted a group of students standing around the quad, laughing and talking in a tight-knit circle. He recognized them as some of the more affluent students in his program, the ones who seemed to glide effortlessly through college life. They were always impeccably dressed, their conversations centered on places Malik had never even heard of. It wasn't that they were cruel to him, but their ease, their effortless success, was a constant reminder of how different his life had been. He was just about to walk past them when he overheard part of their conversation. "I don't know how he does it," one of the girls said, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "I mean, he doesn't even have a calculator during the quizzes. It's like, how is that even possible? Doesn't he realize that if he had access to the same resources we have, he might actually succeed?" Malik froze in his tracks. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to confront them, to ask them how they could be so ignorant, so dismissive of everything he had fought for. But something held him back. Maybe it was the exhaustion of constantly battling to prove himself, or maybe it was the realization that he wasn't just battling their perception of him, he was battling his own fear that they were right. Without saying a word, Malik turned and walked away, retreating to the solitude of his dorm room. The sting of their words was sharp, but it wasn't the first time he had heard something like that. He had grown used to the quiet doubts of others, but today felt different. Today, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be seen as an outsider, someone who didn't truly belong. Malik threw himself onto his bed, his mind racing. The pressure, the isolation, and the constant need to prove himself were wearing him down. He had worked so hard to get here, to stand on equal footing with everyone else. But what if he wasn't good enough? What if the people who doubted him were right? His phone buzzed, breaking him from his spiraling thoughts. It was a message from Ben. "Hey man, I know it's been a tough week for you, but I just wanted to remind you of something. You're not here by accident. You belong here as much as anyone else. Keep pushing." Malik stared at the message, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He couldn't explain why Ben's words were the ones that broke through the wall of doubt in his mind, but they did. It was because Ben wasn't just some guy in his study group, he was someone who saw Malik for who he truly was. Not just the student with the genius IQ, but the person who had fought to get where he was. Malik texted back, his fingers shaking slightly as he typed. "Thanks, man. I really needed to hear that." The next few days were a struggle, but Malik pushed through, one step at a time. He attended class, kept up with his studies, and continued working in the study group. But even as he threw himself into his work, the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. Then, as if the universe was trying to remind him of something, an opportunity came up that would force Malik to confront his insecurities head-on. It was a Friday afternoon when Dr. Simmons announced that the university would be holding a special presentation for high-achieving students. She had selected a few students from the class to give a lecture on a topic of their choice, something that demonstrated their deep understanding of the course material. The chosen students would have the opportunity to present their ideas to a panel of esteemed faculty and industry professionals. Malik's heart raced as Dr. Simmons looked around the room, scanning the students. "I've selected a few of you based on your academic performance and your potential. Malik," she said, pausing to make eye contact with him. "I'd like you to present." Malik's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't that he wasn't capable of giving a presentation, far from it. But standing in front of a room full of accomplished professionals, most of whom came from prestigious backgrounds, was an entirely different challenge. The idea of presenting, of exposing himself to judgment and scrutiny, filled him with dread. But this was his chance. It was his moment to prove that he wasn't just a student from the wrong side of town. He was someone who had earned his place here. Malik's mind raced as Dr. Simmons continued with the announcement. He felt both excitement and dread, like standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether he would fall or soar. When the class ended, he sat still for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle in. This would either make him or break him. And for the first time in a long while, Malik wasn't sure which one it would be. The next few days felt like an endless string of hours leading up to the big presentation. Malik spent every waking moment preparing. He rehearsed his speech in front of the mirror, spent hours fine-tuning the slides, and read over his notes until the material was ingrained in his mind. The nerves were starting to build again, though this time, there was a distinct sense of determination that pushed him forward. This presentation was different from anything he had ever done before. It wasn't just about acing a test or submitting a paper, this was about proving his worth in front of a group of people who would never see him as anything but the outlier. He'd never felt so much pressure, but in a way, it was exactly what he needed. It was his chance to break free from the limitations others tried to impose on him and to show them the person he truly was, not just someone who had fought to get here, but someone who deserved to stay. The night before the presentation, Malik lay awake in his dorm room, staring at the ceiling. The dorm was unusually quiet, the usual hum of noise from the other students absent for the night. For the first time in weeks, Malik allowed himself to acknowledge how far he had come. It wasn't just his genius IQ that had gotten him this far. It was his persistence. It was his ability to adapt, to keep pushing even when the odds seemed stacked against him. He closed his eyes, envisioning the presentation. He pictured himself standing before the panel, calm and collected. He imagined speaking clearly, making his points with conviction, and walking off the stage knowing he had done his best. As the thought settled in, Malik suddenly smiled. The fear wasn't gone, it never would be, but for the first time, he didn't let it control him. The next morning, he woke up early, feeling more rested than he expected. The nerves were still there, but they didn't feel as overwhelming. Malik went through his routine, checked his notes one last time, and took a few deep breaths before heading to the auditorium. The room was already buzzing when he arrived, students talking in small groups, some of them looking just as nervous as he felt. Malik took a deep breath as he walked into the room, the large space making him feel even smaller. The panel of professors sat at the front, their eyes scanning the students. At the very front was Dr. Simmons, who gave him a nod of encouragement as he walked past. "Ready, Malik?" she asked, her voice warm and reassuring. "I think so," Malik replied, his throat dry, but his voice steady. He was nervous, but he was ready. His presentation was last on the agenda, and as he waited for his turn, he couldn't help but notice the other students presenting before him. They were brilliant, confident, and polished. Some spoke with ease, their words flowing without a hitch, while others stumbled, but still managed to impress with their intelligence. Malik listened carefully to their presentations, trying to absorb whatever he could to improve his own. Then it was his turn. Malik's heart skipped a beat as his name was called. He stood up, feeling a mix of nerves and anticipation as he walked to the podium. His hands were clammy, and his palms felt sweaty as he gripped the remote to advance his slides. He glanced out into the audience, the faces of professors and students staring back at him. His gaze locked on Dr. Simmons, who gave him an encouraging smile. He exhaled slowly, standing a little taller. This was it. This was his moment. Malik cleared his throat, pressed the button to start his presentation, and began. The topic he had chosen was one that had intrigued him since he started his studies, the intersection of artificial intelligence and social justice. He talked about how technology could be both a tool for progress and a weapon of oppression, exploring how biases in data could perpetuate inequality in ways that were often overlooked. At first, the words felt strange coming out of his mouth. He wasn't used to speaking in front of people, especially in such a formal setting. His voice wavered slightly, but as he continued, the content of his presentation started to flow more naturally. The more he spoke about the issue, the the more it felt like he was connecting with the material, with the passion behind his words. Malik's eyes darted across the room, picking up on the professor's subtle reactions. Dr. Simmons was nodding along, a proud smile on her face. The other professors seemed interested, leaning forward in their seats, taking notes. By the time he reached the conclusion of his presentation, Malik's nerves had faded into a sense of accomplishment. He'd done it. He'd stood before them and shared something meaningful, something he deeply cared about. The applause that followed felt distant, almost surreal, but it was there, the recognition that he had delivered something worth listening to. When he stepped down from the podium, his heart was racing, but he couldn't stop the smile that spread across his face. He'd done it. He'd faced the battle within himself, the doubts, the fears, and come out on top. As he made his way back to his seat, Dr. Simmons was the first to approach him. She gave him a firm handshake and a look of genuine admiration. "You were outstanding, Malik," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You have a voice that needs to be heard. Don't forget that." Malik nodded, still processing the fact that he had just pulled off one of the biggest challenges of his life. He felt a sense of relief, but more than that, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fears he had carried for so long were no longer a weight on his shoulders. He had proved to himself, and to everyone in that room, that he belonged. That night, as Malik lay in bed, he felt the familiar stirrings of doubt, the whispers of insecurity that had been a constant companion for so long. But this time, they were quieter. This time, he had learned something invaluable. He wasn't just the student who had fought his way into this university. He wasn't just the kid who had to prove himself. He was Malik, someone capable of brilliance, resilience, and change. And that made all the difference. The days following Malik's presentation felt like a dream. Word had spread around campus, and it wasn't just his friends and classmates who were talking about his performance. The professors, the ones who often overlooked him or gave him that look of doubt, were now acknowledging his intelligence in a way they never had before. Malik's email inbox was flooded with invitations to join academic seminars, collaborative projects, and even a research proposal he had never anticipated. But even with all the attention, Malik wasn't sure how to process it. Part of him still felt like he was walking in someone else's shoes, like he was playing a part in a story that didn't truly belong to him. His doubts hadn't vanished, they had just changed form. Now, they whispered in his ear, questioning if this was all just a fluke. Was he really as brilliant as they said, or was it all just a moment of luck, a flurry of preparation that would soon fade away? He sat at his desk, staring at his laptop, the brightness of the screen casting a glow on his face. The emails piled up, each one more flattering than the last, each one a reminder that his life was taking a turn he hadn't expected. But in that moment, as his finger hovered over the delete button on yet another invitation to join a prestigious research team, Malik asked himself a question he had been avoiding. Am I really ready for this? Before he could answer, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Hey, Malik. You in there? It was Ben, his roommate and one of the few people he had confided in about his doubts. Ben had seen Malik go through the hardest parts of this journey, and he knew how much Malik had been struggling to shake off the weight of the perception others had of him. Malik opened the door, and Ben walked in, holding a bag of chips and a couple of cans of soda. Thought you could use some snacks, Ben said with a grin. You looked like you were about to burn through your laptop with that intense stare. Malik chuckled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He motioned for Ben to sit down. I'm just overwhelmed, man. I don't know if I'm cut out for all this attention. What if I mess up? What if everyone realizes I'm just some kid trying to act like he belongs? Ben raised an eyebrow. Are you serious? You just gave a killer presentation. You've been owning this whole university since you got here. Don't you see that? People are taking notice. You're not acting like you belong, you do belong. You've earned it. Malik looked at his friend, the words sinking in slowly. But what if it's all temporary? What if it all falls apart once they realize I'm not who they think I am? Ben shook his head. The thing is, you're probably right, they don't know everything about you. They don't know the struggles you've faced, the battles you've fought to get here. But that doesn't make you any less deserving of your success. It just makes your story even more incredible. Don't let your doubts control what you've already built. Malik paused, his fingers tapping on the desk. Ben's words felt like a lifeline, but they also stirred something deeper in him. Was it true? Could he really shake off the doubt that had followed him for years? He leaned back in his chair, looking at the awards and recognition scattered around his dorm, small reminders of the hard work and the journey that had brought him to this point. But he knew that the true challenge wasn't just the struggle to succeed. It was learning to embrace the success once it arrived. Ben seemed to read his thoughts. You're not just in the right place at the right time. You're in the right place because you've earned it. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise. The conversation lingered with Malik as he walked to his next class. The campus seemed different today. The faces he passed on the sidewalk seemed to look at him with more respect, more recognition. The students who had once overlooked him or written him off now nodded as they passed. The professors who had been skeptical of his potential were starting to acknowledge him with a certain level of regard. He didn't let it go to his head, but it was hard not to notice the shift. It wasn't just the acknowledgement, it was the subtle change in the atmosphere around him. He could feel it, respect. It was something he had been craving, not for his IQ or his talents, but for his hard work and resilience. When Malik entered Dr. Simmons' class that afternoon, the room was quieter than usual. Her gaze swept over the room, and when it landed on Malik, she gave him a subtle but approving nod. She cleared her throat, bringing the class to order. "All right, everyone," she said, her tone focused. "We have a new opportunity for all of you. Malik, would you care to share the latest developments of your research project with the class?" Malik felt his heart race again, but it was different this time. Instead of the familiar dread, there was a pulse of excitement, a new opportunity to demonstrate his abilities. As he stood up, he took a deep breath and began speaking about his project, a proposed algorithm to help reduce bias in predictive policing models. As he spoke, he noticed the class wasn't just listening. They were engaged. Some took notes. Others leaned forward, asking insightful questions. Dr. Simmons had given him the platform, but it was the respect from his peers that made this moment feel like a turning point. As the class came to an end, Dr. Simmons walked up to him. "Malik, I must say, your work is outstanding. I've been speaking with a few colleagues about your ideas, and they're intrigued. There's a possibility of publishing your research. You've come a long way from when you first started here. Keep it up." Malik felt a swell of pride. This wasn't just another passing comment. This was real. This was validation for everything he had worked for. "Thank you, Dr. Simmons. I'll make sure to keep pushing." As he walked back to his dorm, Malik felt different. The weight he had been carrying, the fear, the doubt, the feeling of being an outsider, was starting to lift. He was no longer just the kid trying to fit in. He was Malik, the student with ideas that mattered, the student who had earned his place in this world. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving to himself that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weeks following his successful presentation and the newfound recognition had been a whirlwind for Malik. He found himself constantly in demand, juggling multiple research invitations, attending seminars, and speaking to various academic groups. It was everything he had dreamed of, but with it came a pressure he hadn't expected. He was starting to feel like he was being pulled in too many directions at once. The pressure was not just academic. It was social. He noticed that some of his old friends, the ones who had been with him through thick and thin, were starting to distance themselves. Malik had always been close to his friend group, but now, the dynamic was shifting. He wasn't sure what had caused the shift, maybe it was his newfound attention or the fact that he was now recognized as one of the top students in the class. Either way, it left him feeling isolated in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, as Malik sat in the common room of his dorm, trying to make sense of his notes for an upcoming seminar, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his longtime friend, Jamal. Jamal was one of the few people who had been with Malik since high school. They had shared everything, from late-night study sessions to basketball games on weekends. But lately, Jamal had been acting distant. The last time they hung out, there was an uncomfortable silence between them, one that lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The message read, "Yo, can we talk?" Malik's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this conversation. He quickly texted back, "Yeah, of course." "Where?" A few minutes later, they agreed to meet at a nearby coffee shop, a place they had frequented during their high school days. Malik grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, the cool evening air biting at his skin. As he walked, he couldn't help but wonder what this conversation would be about. Was Jamal mad at him? Was he uncomfortable with Malik's recent success? The questions piled up, but Malik was determined to hear him out. When Malik arrived at the coffee shop, he saw Jamal sitting in a booth near the back. He was staring down at a cup of coffee, his hands wrapped around it tightly. Malik slid into the seat across from him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence felt heavier than it should have, like there was something unsaid between them that neither knew how to address. Finally, Jamal spoke. "Man, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's been happening with you lately." Malik raised an eyebrow, trying to read his friend's expression. "What do you mean?" Jamal sighed, leaning back in his seat. "It's just. I don't know, bro. You've changed. We don't hang out as much anymore. You're always so busy with school, always surrounded by all these people who want a piece of you. It feels like I'm just fading out of the picture." Malik felt a lump form in his throat. He had suspected something like this, but hearing Jamal say it out loud hit harder than he had imagined. "I didn't mean to push you away, man. I've just been so caught up in everything lately. It's like, suddenly, all these doors are opening, and I feel like I can't let them slip away." Jamal nodded slowly. "I get it, Malik. I really do. But sometimes it feels like I'm losing my best friend in the process. You're out there doing all this amazing stuff, but I'm still here, just trying to keep up. You know, we used to talk about everything, your plans, your dreams. Now it's like we're strangers." Malik's heart sank. Jamal wasn't wrong. He had been so focused on the opportunities before him, on proving himself to the world, that he hadn't stopped to check in on the people who had been there from the start. The guilt washed over him like a wave. He had spent so much time trying to fit into a new version of himself that he had neglected the one thing that had always grounded him, his friendship with Jamal. "I'm sorry, man," Malik said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I never meant to make you feel like that. I've been so caught up in everything, I didn't realize how much I was shutting people out. I should have been better at balancing things. You're my friend, Jamal. You've always been there, and I don't want to lose that." Jamal looked up at him, his expression softening. "I just want us to be like we were before, man. No matter what happens with your success, I don't want to be left behind." Malik nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. He knew this conversation was long overdue, but he was glad they were finally having it. "We'll figure it out. I promise. I don't want to lose you as a friend. I'll make more time for us, for the things that matter." They sat there for a few more minutes, catching up on life and reminiscing about their high school days. It felt good to talk openly again, to be real with each other. Malik realized that success wasn't just about proving something to the world, it was about staying grounded in the relationships that had shaped him. Jamal had been his anchor, and no amount of recognition could replace the value of that. When they finally parted ways, Malik felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. He wasn't just carrying the pressure of his academic achievements, he was also carrying the responsibility of keeping his friendships intact. As he walked back to his dorm, he made a vow to himself. He wasn't going to let his success drive a wedge between him and the people who had always been there for him. He would find a way to balance his ambitions with his relationships, to keep pushing forward without leaving anyone behind. Later that evening, as Malik sat at his desk, he stared at the emails in his inbox once again. The offers, the invitations, the opportunities, they were still there. But for the first time in a while, Malik didn't feel overwhelmed by them. He felt ready. He felt like he could handle everything, not just because of his intelligence or his ability, but because he had his friends by his side. And that, in itself, was success. Malik had always prided himself on his ability to rise to the occasion. No challenge was too great, no test too impossible. But as the semester wore on, the demands on his time and energy seemed to multiply. His newfound success in the academic world had created a buzz on campus, and while many celebrated his achievements, it also brought a new level of expectation. It wasn't just about doing well in class anymore. Now, people expected him to be a leader, a role model, a genius. He had been invited to speak at conferences, asked to mentor younger students, and offered research collaborations by professors from various departments. For the first time in his life, Malik felt like his intelligence was not only acknowledged but demanded. It was exhilarating, but also exhausting. Every time he finished one project, another would appear on the horizon, waiting for his attention. But it wasn't just the academic challenges that were weighing on him. Malik had begun to feel like he was losing himself in the hustle. The same doubts he had fought off earlier in the semester were now creeping back. Was he doing all of this because he loved it, or because he was afraid of losing the spotlight? Was he still the same Malik who had struggled to get into college, or had he become someone else, someone defined by others' expectations? Malik sat in the library one evening, staring at the complex equations in front of him. He had been working for hours, but he couldn't shake the sense of frustration building inside him. No matter how many breakthroughs he had made, how many doors he had opened, something inside him felt unsettled. He rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, glancing around the library. It was then that he saw her. Amara was sitting at a nearby table, her nose buried in a textbook. She had become a close friend over the past few months, someone who understood the pressures Malik was going through. They had spent countless late nights studying together, sharing notes, and even venting about the weight of their academic lives. Malik had grown to admire her for her strength, her focus, and her unshakable belief in herself. She glanced up from her book and caught Malik's eye. She smiled warmly, the kind of smile that made Malik feel like everything would be okay, no matter how tough things got. "Need a break?" she asked, her voice soft yet confident. Malik hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I think so." They grabbed coffee from the campus cafe and found a quiet bench outside, the chill of the evening air giving them a refreshing break from the intensity of the library. The campus was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. "I can tell something's been bothering you," Amara said, her tone gentle but perceptive. "What's going on?" Malik hesitated again, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. He had never been one to open up easily, but Amara had a way of making him feel comfortable, like he could share his thoughts without fear of judgment. "I feel like I'm drowning, Amara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've got all these opportunities, all these people who want something from me, and I'm just trying to keep up. But I don't know if I'm doing it for the right reasons anymore. I'm not even sure I'm doing it for myself." Amara was quiet for a moment, taking in his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and measured. "You're doing it because you're passionate, Malik. Don't forget that. I've seen the way your eyes light up when you talk about your research, the way you dive into problems with a focus I've never seen before. But you're right, it's easy to get caught up in everything else. The accolades, the praise, the expectations. They can drown out the reasons you started all of this in the first place. Malik looked at her, his mind racing. She was right. When he thought back to the beginning, back to the days when he first discovered his love for science and technology, it had never been about fame or recognition. It had always been about curiosity, about the desire to understand the world around him, to solve problems and make a difference. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that. "You're right," he said, his voice stronger now. "I've been so focused on meeting everyone's expectations that I forgot why I started all of this. It's not about proving something to the world. It's about pushing myself to be better, to create something that can help others. I need to get back to that." Amara smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I knew you'd figure it out. You've always had it in you. Just don't let the noise drown out your voice." Malik smiled back, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the demands on him would only grow, but he knew he couldn't lose himself in the process. He had to remember why he was doing this, why he had come this far. It was about more than accolades or recognition. It was about the impact he could have, the difference he could make in the world. As they finished their coffee and walked back to the dorm, Malik felt a renewed sense of purpose. The ultimate challenge wasn't just about succeeding in the eyes of others, it was about staying true to himself, about balancing ambition with authenticity. The next day, as Malik stood before a room full of students at a prestigious academic conference, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. This time, it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about sharing what he had learned, the challenges he had overcome, and the insights he had gained along the way. It was about being the best version of himself, not just for others, but for himself as well. And as the applause filled the room after his presentation, Malik couldn't help but smile. He had found his balance, and that was the greatest achievement of all. The sun was beginning to set over the campus, casting a warm golden light across the quad. Malik walked through the bustling campus, his mind swirling with the events of the past few weeks. The speech at the academic conference had been a success, and the recognition he had gained was both exhilarating and overwhelming. For the first time in a long while, Malik felt like he was finally where he was meant to be, but there was something inside him that still felt unsettled, something he couldn't quite place. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Professor Carter, his mentor, who had been a constant source of guidance throughout his academic journey. Malik had met Professor Carter early in his college career, and the professor had always pushed him to strive for greatness, to challenge himself in ways he never thought possible. But lately, their interactions had been more distant. Malik wasn't sure why, but he sensed there was something on the professor's mind. The message read, "Malik, I'd like to meet with you. Please come by my office when you have a moment." Malik felt a wave of unease wash over him. He had always respected Professor Carter, and the professor had always been fair with him, but there was something in the tone of the message that made him nervous. Had he done something wrong? Was the success he had experienced starting to raise eyebrows in ways he hadn't anticipated? He quickly texted back, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. As Malik made his way to the professor's office, his heart beat a little faster. He had spent countless hours in this building, but today, it felt different. The walls seemed to close in on him as he climbed the stairs to the second floor. He knocked lightly on the door to Professor Carter's office before stepping in. "Come in," came the professor's voice from inside. Malik opened the door and stepped into the professor's office, where he found Professor Carter sitting behind a large wooden desk, scribbling something on a piece of paper. His office was filled with shelves of books, papers stacked neatly in piles, and a large whiteboard covered in equations and theories. "Malik, have a seat," Professor Carter said, motioning to the chair across from him. Malik sat down, his stomach nodding as he waited for the conversation to begin. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it was going to be important. "How have you been?" Professor Carter asked, setting his pen down and looking at Malik with a curious expression. "I've been good," Malik replied, his voice steady but betraying a hint of uncertainty. "A lot going on, but I'm managing." The professor nodded. "I know you've been under a lot of pressure lately. And I've been watching your progress closely. You've been doing outstanding work, Malik. I'm impressed by the strides you've made. But there's something I need to talk to you about." Malik leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What's that?" Professor Carter took a deep breath. "I've been hearing some things around campus, things about you, your research, your projects. And I'm starting to wonder if you're getting too much too fast." Malik felt his chest tighten at the professor's words. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Professor Carter continued, "you've been jumping from one project to another, from one opportunity to the next, and I'm worried you're burning out. There's no doubt in my mind that you're talented, Malik. You've got the drive and the intellect to go far. But you need to be careful. It's easy to get lost in all of this. It's easy to forget why you started in the first place." Malik swallowed hard, trying to steady his emotions. He had always valued Professor Carter's guidance, and hearing these words from him hit harder than he expected. "I'm not getting lost, Professor. I'm just trying to do everything I can. I don't want to waste the opportunities I've been given." The professor studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp yet compassionate. "I understand that. But it's also important to remember that success doesn't come from doing everything. It comes from doing what truly matters, what speaks to your heart. I think you need to take a step back, Malik. You've been running full speed ahead, but maybe it's time to stop and figure out what it is you really want." Malik felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Deep down, he knew that his mentor was right. He had been chasing one achievement after another, thinking that if he kept moving, he would prove something to the world, to everyone who had ever doubted him. But the question lingered in the back of his mind: what did he really want? "I don't know what I want anymore," Malik admitted, his voice quiet. "I thought if I just kept going, kept proving myself, I'd eventually figure it out. But now, I'm not sure. I feel like I've been running a race without knowing where the finish line is." Professor Carter nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's the problem with racing, Malik. You forget why you started running in the first place. You need to stop and ask yourself, what's the point of all this?" The words hit Malik like a ton of bricks. For so long, he had been focused on winning the race, on achieving success, that he had never stopped to question what he wanted to achieve in the first place. It wasn't about the accolades, the recognition, or the expectations. It was about finding purpose, about making a difference, about using his gifts for something meaningful. "I think you're right, Professor," Malik said, his voice filled with clarity. "I need to slow down. I've been so caught up in the noise that I've lost sight of what really matters." Professor Carter smiled warmly. "It's never too late to find your way back, Malik. You're on the right path. Just don't forget to stop and breathe along the way." Malik stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer going to chase after success for the sake of success. He was going to chase it for the right reasons, for his own growth, for his passion, and for the people he cared about. As he left the professor's office, the weight he had been carrying for months seemed to lighten. Malik had taken the first step toward finding his true purpose. And that was a victory in itself. The days following his conversation with Professor Carter were some of the most transformative of Malik's life. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the constant pressure to succeed, to meet expectations, to prove something to the world. Instead, he allowed himself to take a step back and reflect on what he truly wanted, what success really meant to him. It wasn't an easy process. The demands of college life, the relentless pace of assignments and projects, and the weight of expectations from peers and professors all remained present. But something had shifted within Malik. He had learned to prioritize his passion over external recognition, to value his well-being over constant validation. Malik found himself spending more time in the quiet corners of the library, immersed in his research, but this time, there was no rush. He explored topics that genuinely intrigued him, the kind of subjects that sparked his curiosity and excitement, not just those that would look good on his resume. He rediscovered his love for science, for problem-solving, and for learning without the pressure of achieving something for the sake of recognition. One evening, as Malik sat in the library working on a complex algorithm, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his best friend, Jason. "Hey, Malik. Want to grab dinner tonight? I'm taking a break from studying, and I think we could both use some time away from campus." Malik smiled at the message. He had spent so much time consumed by his academic life that he had neglected his friendships. Jason had been there for him through the toughest times, always supportive, always ready to remind him to enjoy the simple pleasures in life. Malik quickly typed back, "Sounds perfect. Let's meet in 30 minutes." They met at their favorite diner, a small, cozy spot off campus where they had spent countless hours talking about everything, from classes to dreams of the future. The familiarity of the place, the comforting scent of greasy diner food, and the casual atmosphere made Malik feel grounded. As he sat down across from Jason, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for months. Jason looked at Malik with a raised eyebrow, noticing the change in his demeanor. "You're different, man. You seem calmer." Malik chuckled, stirring his drink. "Yeah, I think I finally figured out what I've been missing." Jason grinned. "I'm guessing it's not just about acing every test anymore." Malik nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the conversation with Professor Carter. "It's not. I've been so focused on trying to prove something to everyone else that I forgot to ask myself why I'm doing all of this. What's the point of all these achievements if they're not aligned with who I am, with what I actually care about?" Jason's expression softened. "I've always admired how driven you are, Malik. But sometimes, I think you get so caught up in being the best that you forget to enjoy the journey. It's not just about getting to the top, it's about what you learn along the way." Malik leaned back in his seat, taking in his friend's words. He had always been the ambitious one, the one pushing for more, never satisfied with anything less than perfection. But now, sitting here, he realized that true success wasn't measured by awards, accolades, or recognition. It was about growth, balance, and happiness. "You're right," Malik said, his voice sincere. "I've been so caught up in the race that I forgot to appreciate the ride." Jason nodded in understanding. "It's never too late to start enjoying the ride, man. You're on the right track." Malik smiled. "Thanks, Jason. I think I'm finally starting to figure things out." The rest of their dinner was filled with easy conversation, laughter, and the comfort of friendship. For the first time in a long while, Malik felt like he could just breathe. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to meet anyone's expectations but his own. Over the next few weeks, Malik continued to focus on his research, but with a new sense of purpose. He no longer felt the pressure to be the best, to win every competition or earn every accolade. Instead, he embraced the joy of learning, of challenging himself, and of discovering new ideas that excited him. As the semester drew to a close, Malik received an unexpected invitation from one of his professors. It was an offer to collaborate on a groundbreaking project that could revolutionize the field of artificial intelligence. It was an opportunity that Malik had dreamed of, but this time, he didn't jump at it without thinking. Instead, he took a step back, just as he had learned to do. He carefully considered the project, the potential impact it could have, and whether it aligned with his passions and long-term goals. After much thought, Malik decided to accept the offer, not because it was the next big step in his career, but because it was a challenge he truly wanted to take on, something that excited him on a deeper level. The next few years flew by, but Malik never lost sight of what he had learned in that pivotal moment: success wasn't about being the best. It wasn't about winning at all costs. It was about growth, balance, and making a meaningful impact in the world. Malik went on to accomplish incredible things in his field, earning recognition and respect from his peers, but he never let the pursuit of success overshadow his love for the work itself. As he looked back on his journey, Malik realized that the greatest achievement wasn't the awards, the recognition, or the accolades. It was the transformation he had undergone, from a student driven by external validation to a man driven by purpose and passion. And that, he knew, was the true meaning of success. And in that moment, Malik knew that the race wasn't about finishing first. It was about running with integrity, enjoying every step, and making the most of the journey. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?